2 years ago, I posted a video showing how I fixed this clock and got it running again, but I made too many mistakes and I just couldn't let it go. I read every single comment that's left on my videos, and I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do that, especially when you let me know when I've done something wrong or could have done something a little bit better. Like I already mentioned, I made many mistakes last time, and we'll get into each of those, but one of the biggest mistakes I made was using 3-in-1 oil to oil the pivots. And later on in the video, I'll show you the correct oil to use and how to save some money if you decide to use this oil too. Alright, so let's get into it. First thing I've got to do is get the hands off, get the dial off, and then I can finally get the movement out, and then the real fun can begin. So there are 4 screws holding the movement in, and last time many of you pointed out that I should have used slotted screws to be consistent with the time period of the clock. So later on I'm going to replace these with the correct screws. Alright, so the movement is out, and I'm just going to give it a quick look over, and you'll notice that the great wheels and the mainsprings are a lot dirtier than the rest of the movement. And that's because, as some of you pointed out last time, I didn't clean or lubricate the mainsprings. Now this was something I intentionally decided not to do last time because I didn't have the skills or equipment needed to take something like that on, but this time they're getting cleaned and lubricated. So before I start taking the movement apart, it's really important to restrain and let down the mainsprings. And what I like to do is use 2 zip ties per mainspring, and each zip tie has a tensile strength of 60 pounds. Now there are metal clamps you can buy specifically designed to restrain mainsprings, but I've had pretty good luck with the zip ties so far. To unwind the mainspring, I first have to move the click spring out of the way, and then slowly and carefully unwind the mainspring. The first thing I do is actually start to wind the mainspring, which moves the click out of the way, and then I can start to unwind it. Here the click did not want to move out of the way, probably because it's a little dirty, but I gave it a little nudge and that did the trick. All right, so the mainsprings are let down, so now it's safe to completely disassemble the movement. Last time I took this movement apart, I didn't have any nut drivers, and so I decided to use needle nose pliers to loosen the nuts. And many of you pointed out that I shouldn't have used needle nose pliers and I should buy proper tools for the job. And so that's what I did. Next, I'm going to remove the stop works, and I'll talk a little bit more about these later, but basically what they're designed to do is limit how much a spring can be wound or unwound by kind of jamming or locking up. And both of these are currently in that locked up state, meaning I couldn't unwind these springs any farther. So as I'm taking the movement apart, you might notice some white paste on some of the parts. And that's because last time I got the bright idea to use white lithium grease on the clock, thinking it'll help it run smoother, it'll help it run better. But as many of you pointed out, I shouldn't have used white lithium grease, so all of that's getting cleaned off. Next, I'm going to remove the count wheel clip and the count wheel. And the mainspring that you see here drives the striking side of the clock. And the count wheel actually determines how many times the clock's going to chime. So it'll chime once on the 30-minute mark, and it'll chime the number of times for whatever hour that it lands on. So if it's 5 o'clock, it'll chime 5 times. All right, so this is what a completely disassembled Gilbert clock looks like, at least for this model. Now it's time to remove the mainsprings from the great wheels. This is a mainspring winder that I designed and built myself, and I've been using it the last couple of years with pretty good success. And I do have a video on how I made this, so there should be a link popping up on the screen now, and I'll also put a link in the description. So it's really important that you wear a face shield and leather gloves when you're dealing with these mainsprings, because if they get away from you, you could really get yourself hurt. And later on in the video, when I go to wind up one of these mainsprings, some things went down, and a mainspring got away from me, not once, not twice, but multiple times. And I'm really glad I was wearing a leather glove, because had I not, well, I think things would have gotten pretty bloody for me. So stick around and you'll see what happened. All right, so now it's time to remove the mainspring from the great wheel. And this can sometimes be pretty tricky because there is a pin on the side of the arbor that is inserted into a hole in the innermost coil of the mainspring, and you can kind of see it there. Best case scenario, all you would need to do is rotate the arbor like you're unwinding the mainspring, and the pin should just pop out of that hole. But this mainspring is pretty old, and those innermost coils are really tight, and it doesn't leave enough room for that pin to move out of that hole. So what I'm trying to do here is use a flathead screwdriver just to widen that hole just a little bit so I can wiggle that pin free. And I ended up fiddling with this for quite a while, but eventually I was able to get the pin popped out of that hole. So if you look right there, you can see the pin, and it's no longer in the hole in the spring. So I should just be able to pull the great wheel off of the spring now. And there we go. One thing I noticed about this mainspring, other than it being really dirty, is that it's completely dry. There's no oil or lubrication at all on this mainspring. To clean the mainspring, I'm going to use WD-40 and some steel wool. And typically it's best practice not to get WD-40 anywhere near your clock. But in this case, I'm going to use it as a cleaning agent, and then I'm going to use mineral spirits to remove any leftover residue that the WD-40 might leave behind. And that's just to clean the mainspring. After it's clean, I'm going to use some mainspring lubricant to finish it off. Alright, so this mainspring is cleaned and lubricated, and it's got a nice shine to it now. Alright, so now it's time to deal with the mainspring that drives the time side of the clock. And I'm going to follow the same procedure that I did on the other mainspring. So one thing that I noticed right away on this mainspring is that the innermost coils are really tightly wound, and I fear that I'm going to have a really tough time getting that pin out of that hole. Yeah, that pin is even beginning to budge, so now I'm going to have to try to widen that innermost coil a little bit. I ended up fiddling with this for quite a while, and I didn't show it all here in the video just to save you from some of the pain that I had to go through. But I eventually got the pin out of the hole, and I could remove the great wheel from the mainspring. One thing that I noticed, other than my fingers are now really dirty, is that there seems to be some sort of defect in the metal there, and I'm not quite sure what would have caused that. Now that the mainsprings are cleaned and lubricated, it's time to clean all the other parts of the movement. So I finally decided to buy a bigger 6-liter ultrasonic cleaner, which is a huge step up from my little dinky ultrasonic cleaner that's really meant for small pieces of jewelry or things like that. So what I decided to use was Crystal Simple Green and some distilled water. And I wasn't quite sure of the exact ratio to use, so I just did a little bit of the Crystal Simple Green. So I did a lot of research online to try to find out what was the best solution to use. And it seems like everyone and their dog has their own concoction that they mix up. And I've actually had some of you guys reach out to me and share what you use in your ultrasonic cleaners, and I appreciate that. But I didn't know which direction to go, so that's why I decided to go with the Crystal Simple Green, because it seemed like a pretty safe solution to use. So I set this up to run at 40 degrees Celsius, which is 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and to run for 20 minutes. So let me know what you guys think on those settings. Is that too hot, not hot enough? Is that too long or not long enough? I decided to add a mesh screen to the bottom of this basket because I didn't want anything sticking through and making contact with the bottom of the ultrasonic cleaner. I would imagine that would wreak havoc on any of the pivots. So I bought this pack of mesh screen, which is the same type of stainless steel that the basket in the ultrasonic cleaner is made out of, and cut it to size and stuck it down there in the bottom. This is the first time using this ultrasonic cleaner and this solution, so I'm a little nervous and excited to see how things turn out. Wow, look at that. I think it did a pretty good job. Now I'm going to clean everything with mineral spirits just to make sure there's no leftover solution residue, and then I'll dry everything with a heat gun. So it looks like the ultrasonic cleaner didn't get everything off, and I don't know if that's because I used the wrong temperature or the wrong time. So if you have any thoughts on that, just let me know. I'm really quite impressed how clean these parts came out of the ultrasonic cleaner. There was just no way I could get things this clean by hand like I was doing before. Just to show a quick comparison, the great wheel on the right has been through the ultrasonic cleaner and the one on the left has not. And you can really tell the difference there. So one thing I was wondering about as I was going through this process was if I was utilizing the space in the basket correctly. Because one thing I was nervous about was packing the basket too full or the parts would rub against each other and actually cause some sort of damage. So I decided to do things in smaller batches just to be on the safe side. Hey look, someone put white lithium grease in there. I wonder how that got in there. Guess we'll never know. Now I did look over both plates to check for any worn pivot holes, and I didn't see any. They all looked pretty good to me. And this might be because the clock didn't run for at least 40 or 50 years that I'm aware of from what I've been told, because it just didn't work. But if you want to see what a worn pivot hole looks like and how I fixed it, I'll provide a link to one of my other videos and you can check that out. So I decided to prop the hammer up like that because there's a leather tip on the end and I didn't know how that would react to the solution, so I just try to keep it out of there. Alright, so now it's time to put everything back together, and I'm going to start with the mainsprings, and then I'll move on to assembling the movement. Now I'm going to try to attach the mainspring back to the arbor on this great wheel. And as you can see, this is for the striking side of the movement because it has the count wheel on it. And so the trick is to get that pin to insert just right so it goes into the hole in the inner coil. And then it should just pop right in. And there we go. So now I'm going to give it a few turns just to make sure that the pin really is in that hole. And you can see that the spring is rotating when I turn it. Now I was really concerned about this mainspring because that inner coil is so tight that I was nervous that I wouldn't even be able to get that arbor to fit in there. It goes in, but there's not enough room for that pin to go in. It's stuck on the outside, as you can see there. So now I have to figure out a way to get that hole to widen up a little bit. So it looks like it snapped in right there, but as I was turning it and looking in the inner coil, I could tell that the pin wasn't actually in the hole. It was stuck on the side of the inner coil. So now I got to try to pop the spring off and try again. So I wasn't quite sure what tool to use to widen that hole a little bit, so I decided to use these, which might have been a bad idea. I think I ended up bending the tool more than the inner coil, but I think it did the trick. If you guys have dealt with this sort of problem before and have any suggestions, please let me know. Alright, it looks like I got it. It might be hard to see here, but the pin is in the hole and the spring is turning when I spin the arbor. All right, so now it's time to wind up the mainsprings, and everything went as planned on this one. The next spring, however, not so good. After watching this back, I can see what I did wrong on this one. I slowed down winding it up, and then I accidentally started winding it the wrong way, and it popped off. But my problems did not end there. And the other problem I was having is I can't feel what my fingers are touching through the leather glove, and I kept knocking the hook out of the loop on the mainspring. I also think I wasn't winding the spring up enough, and it kept wanting to cone out to the side, which was also causing me some problems. Now this one was the scariest of them all. I thought I really screwed up the mainspring on this one. It was all tangled up in itself. Alright, so I finally got it. So now I'm going to quickly get this thing zip tied so I don't have any more surprises. So one of the limitations of this mainspring winder is I need to have a free hand to set the lock on the crank. And when I'm having problems like I just had, it makes it extremely difficult to do that. So at some point in the future, I might make a modification to this winder to solve that problem. Now it's time to reassemble the movement, and this is where any reference pictures or videos really come in handy if you forget where something goes. Here I'm showing how I calculate the beats per minute, or BPM, that the clock should run at. And I do this by counting the teeth in the pinions from the escape wheel to the center wheel. So before I reassembled everything, I took those wheels aside and counted everything, and wrote those numbers down, did this simple calculation, and I came up with a number of 148.57. So later on in the video, I show how I set up the clock to pretty much run at that rate. Alright, so this is where things can get very, very time consuming. At least it does for me. And that's because you have to get all of the pivots back into their pivot holes. And so what I like to do is I'll start in a particular corner and screw down that nut so the plate stays in place. And then I slowly go to each pivot and try to get them to go back into their pivot hole. And this is what it looks like between the plates. It's just a mess in there. So you really got to have some patience and try not to force anything. If something isn't going where you want it to go, try not to force it too much. Take a step back and look at what's going wrong and then go from there. Here I'm taking the spring wire for the count lever and trying to wrap it back around that post. And that didn't work. So I'm going to try to put a little bit more of a bend in that so it wraps around that post a little bit better. And there we go. Now the count lever should be a little springy. Okay, so now I'm going to do a quick test of the striking side of the movement just to make sure I set up everything correctly. The count lever should stop in each of those deep notches on the count wheel. So there is a warning pin on the warning wheel, the one that I'm turning right there, that should fall in the path of the locking lever at the appropriate time to stop the count lever from raising back up again. And it looks like everything is working the way it should. Alright, so a little bit more about the stop works. So this star wheel has one extra long tooth with a total of 8 teeth, and it belongs with the winding arbor. The other star wheel has a total of 9 teeth with one shallow valley. So as the mainspring unwinds, since they have a different number of teeth, a given tooth on the drive star wheel will mesh with a different valley on the other star wheel. So when a long tooth lands in the shallow valley, the mainspring stops unwinding because the stopwork gears are effectively jammed, and the same is true for winding. So here I've configured the stopworks to not allow the mainsprings to unwind beyond where they are right now. So the purpose of the stopworks is to restrict the winding and unwinding of the mainspring to the central flat part of the energy release curve and avoid the extreme ends of that release curve. Alright, so now I want to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, the Horace Whitlock Oil Company. Horace Whitlock clock oil is hand-mixed in small batches and designed to perform perfectly on all style, brands, and makes of mechanical clocks, as well as music boxes. It's designed not to gum up, dry out, evaporate, or tarnish brass. It will also not melt lacquers or varnishes and has an incredibly long shelf life. Using good quality oil specifically designed for clock movements is the most important decision you will make when re-oiling a clock movement. So don't be like me and use 3-in-1 oil or some other rogue oil on your clock. I've been using this oil for 2 years now and I've been pretty happy with it. Having the correct viscosity for the operation of a clock is really important. Too thin and the pivot will not float in the bushing correctly, allowing for faster wear of the bushings, and too thick of an oil and the resistance and drag on the pivot will slow the gear down, eventually stopping the gear from moving. So as you're about to see, the oil is perfectly designed such that capillary action retains the oil within the pivot hole, allowing the pivot to float and move freely. They also have sewing machine oil, knife oil, and other oils coming soon. So when you use the discount code WATCH on their website, you'll receive 15% off your entire order. This oil also makes a great gift idea if you know someone who is into clocks or wants to start learning. So if you're interested, check out the video description for links to their website. And again, that code is WATCH for 15% off. Okay, so we don't need these zip ties around the mainsprings anymore. So what I'm going to do is start with the striking side of the movement and get that wound up a little bit and cut off the zip ties. And then I'll test the striking mechanism just to make sure everything is still working correctly. So if everything is working correctly, the warning pin should engage with the locking lever and stop the count lever. And it looks like it's working. Now it's time to start winding the time side of the movement. And if everything is working correctly, you should start seeing the clock tick and come to life, which is pretty exciting. So I bought a box of these slotted screws, so we won't be needing those other screws anymore. So I'm going to take out 4 of those and we can get the movement back into the case. A little bit ago, I looked at where the count lever was on the count wheel to try to figure out where to put the hands back. And here in a little bit, I'll give it a small test just to see if I put those in the right spot. So if I put the hands back in the right spot, it should chime 8 times. Okay, so that was 9 times. So this is how you fix it. Pretty simple. Now it's time to attach the pendulum and get the beat rate set correctly. So I use this app, and there's a link in the description for it, that listens to the ticks and tocks of the clock and calculates the actual beats per minute, which is in the lower left-hand corner. It also looks at the consistency of the beat and whether the clock's leveled or not, so it's packed with a lot of helpful information. Right now it's saying I need to raise the bob on the pendulum. So now it's saying that the beats per minute is around 148.3.4, which is still lower than the calculated beats per minute that I calculated, which is 148.57. So I got to raise it up again. All right, so now it's saying around 150 beats per minute. So now I raised it up too high. So I got to lower the bob now. Now it's saying around 148.43, which is pretty close. I think it's close enough. Well, thanks for taking some time to watch this video. Please feel free to like and subscribe because that really helps support the channel. Thanks, and take care.